Hi, today I want to talk about what I think is an underappreciated aspect of the life and ministry of Jesus, and that is the Ascension. How often do you think about and talk about the Ascension? If you are like most people, I think the answer to the question is not very much. We talk a lot about the birth of Christ. We have a blast celebrating Christmas. We like to talk a lot about the life and ministry of Jesus. We like to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, almost to the point that in some churches it becomes like an obsession. We don't want to talk about anything else but the cross. And then we also like to talk a lot about the resurrection of Christ, and we make a big deal about celebrating Easter, and quite right too. But the thing is, I don't know that I heard much talk about the ascension in my earliest days as a Christian. I mean, I think that I knew about it. I think if you were to ask me what happened to the resurrected body, I would know that the answer was the ascension, because I knew that there wasn't a body of Jesus walking around today. The thing is, basically every other aspect of the life of Jesus is widely understood as having a strong connection to our actual salvation. If I were to ask you what the connection is between the crucifixion and our salvation, you would almost draw some kind of connection between Jesus' death on the cross, his self-sacrifice, and our atonement. Although how people draw that connection might be different from person to person. If I were to ask you what meaning the resurrection has for our salvation, you would almost certainly, at the very least, connect it with Good Friday and say it's God's acceptance of Good Friday. But then you might go on and emphasize that the resurrection of Jesus is actually the promise for our resurrection for the future. And so it is the single greatest place to talk about what it means to have life beyond this one. Now, some people at least are a little bit less clear about the impact that Christ's birth has on our salvation. At the very least, you'd hear people talk about this idea that Jesus had to be born in order for him to be able to lay down his life for us. But you might go farther and talk about how even the taking on of our human flesh is vitally important for how we think about what it means to be saved. Now, if I were to ask you what is the importance of the ascension for our understanding of our salvation, I think most people would not really be sure what to say about that. It's one of those things that I think we know, and we might even suspect it might be a big deal, but we don't really know why it's a big deal. I want to give you my answer to that question today. Now, first, I want to remind you of something that I think we can forget if we're not paying careful attention, and that is that the resurrection and the ascension did not take place on the same day. The ascension happens 40 days later, and we have these 40 days of Jesus talking with his disciples and having fellowship with them, and I have always wondered why it is we don't really get any teaching that happens during those 40 days, and it leads me at least to the conclusion that probably Jesus wasn't doing a whole lot of new teaching to his disciples. He was mostly reminding them of things they had already heard before the betrayal and resurrection. Now, another thing we have to get straight before we talk about the importance of the ascension is the question of how many altars there are in the temple in the Old Testament and during Jesus' day. And I think if you were to ask a lot of people in the church how many altars were there in the temple, it might be tempting to say, well, there's one, there's the altar. But there are different numbers depending on who you talk to. But there are at least three that I'm aware of, and that is there's one altar where you burn the animals and the plants as offerings, another altar where you burn incense, and a third altar that's in the Holy of Holies that's entered into once a year on the Day of Atonement. It's also really important that we remember and keep straight the fact that animals were sacrificed, animals were actually killed on none of those three altars. And that's important because we sometimes will talk about sacrificing or slaying animals on the altar, but they really weren't. They were not slayed on the altar. They were presented to the altar, but they were killed somewhere else. Part of that's because sacrificing animals is a messy business. Part of that's because the priests had to get their portion of the sacrifice. The point is that animals were killed somewhere else. They had to be processed, and then they were taken to the altar in order to be burned. What this means is that as important as it is that a sacrifice is made and that the animal is actually killed as part of that, atonement is not worked out by the killing, by the death of the animal, and that gives us a clue as to why the ascension is so extremely important. In the Old Testament, we read about a celebration called, it's the Day of Atonement, or called Yom Kippur. And on that day, there was a ritual that took place that, depending on your perspective, was either God decisively dealing with sin for the past year, or else it was God postponing the need to deal with that sin for another year. Now, in this ritual on the Day of Atonement, there were two animals that were involved. And kind of the first one is called the scapegoat. And on that animal is where the high priest would lay his hands on that animal and confess all of the sins of the people of Israel on it. And then they would drive the animal out into the wilderness where it would almost certainly be killed by wild animals. That is a crucially important thing to remember, and it's vitally important as we try to understand the significance of the baptism of Jesus. But that's going to have to wait for a different video. Today, we're mostly interested in the second lamb. Now, that lamb has its throat cut, and the blood is gathered up and taken into the Holy of Holies, and the blood is applied to the altar, which is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, there are a couple things about this. First of all, there are some people in the church who think that the blood is primarily symbolic of death. And there are people who have been in the church or either maybe have left the church who think that the obsession with the talk about blood in the church makes God seem very barbaric, and it makes it seem like we and God are both absolutely obsessed with death. But that's not the case. Because in the book of Leviticus, we read that blood is not to be consumed by the people of Israel. And the rationale that's given for that is that the people are not to consume the blood, which is the life of the animal. So biblically, this notion of blood doesn't symbolize death, it symbolizes life. And so when we think about blood within the context of Scripture, we have to think about it not so much as blood that's left on the side of a battlefield, but blood more like is given as a donation to save a life. To bring blood into the Holy of Holies is not to bring death into the presence of God, it's to bring life into the presence of God. The other thing we need to notice is that atonement is not said to be worked out when the animal dies, but when the blood has been taken into the Holy of Holies and applied to the altar. That means there is a lag, there is a delay between the death of the sacrifice and when atonement is said to be worked out. So, how is all of this related to the Ascension? It has a lot to do with what we read in the book of Hebrews. And I need to point out that a lot of where I got this information from or how I got to learn about explaining things this way comes from a guy named David Moffat, who was teaching at St. Andrews, and he gave this unbelievable paper on the topic while we were there. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament is absolutely obsessed with the connections between what Jesus did and what we read about in the book of Leviticus. We don't know for sure who wrote the book of Hebrews, but whoever it was, they were absolutely obsessed with making it clear that Jesus needs to be understood as our high priest, and even that the gospel doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless Jesus is serving as our high priest. However, depending on your point of view, there could be a problem with that. You see, according to the Old Testament, you couldn't just have any old person become the high priest of the people. In order to be the high priest, you had to be taken from the line of Aaron within the tribe of Levi. And the reason why that could be a problem is because Jesus is famously from the line of David in the tribe of Judah, and therefore he's from a line of people who have no business being priests according to the Old Testament lineage. Hebrews doesn't have a problem with that because, as it points out, Jesus never operated as a priest while on earth. He never oversaw sacrifices in the temple. He never dressed in priestly robes. He was not a priest here on earth. But Hebrews also points out that there is a second example of what it means to be a high priest of God in the person of Melchizedek. Now, I don't know for sure that I've gotten my head all the way around how the book of Hebrews talks about the priesthood of Melchizedek. But the main point seems to be that we have an example in the Old Testament of someone who was called to be a priest of God who was completely outside of the line of Aaron. And that seems to imply that there are other qualifications that could be brought to bear in a case that could qualify someone to be a priest other than being a descendant of Aaron. Hebrews says in chapter 8, verse 4, that Jesus didn't have to function as a priest while he was here on earth because there were already priests on earth doing priestly things. But it goes on to explain that Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry than them. And in just the previous chapter, we read that Jesus has his priesthood not because of some law of succession, but because of the power of his indestructible life. Why does this matter? According to the Old Testament, you can only be a minister of atonement if you are a priest. And Jesus is not a priest on earth, but he is only a priest in heaven. And the book of Hebrews also tells us that this temple that God designs in the Old Testament and is built is not simply a building. It's not merely something people came up with. It is meant to be kind of a shadowy copy on earth of what's going on in God's place in the heavens. This is what all that means. God designs and sets up temple worship in the Old Testament as a copy of the way things work in God's world. And then, even though the animal sacrifices could never fully deal with the issue of sin, they begin to give us a clue of what's going on and why. Over thousands of years, people begin to get this idea of how atonement works. And a big part of atonement is a lamb has to be slain in one place, and then the high priest has to take the blood of that sacrifice, take it into the Holy of Holies, and apply that blood to the altar in order to complete the act of atonement. So now, in the New Testament, we see Jesus come, and we see him lay himself down in an act of self-sacrifice where his blood is shed. But if there's a parallel, if the book of Leviticus has told us anything about how atonement works, then we know it's not enough just for the blood to be shed. It's not even enough just to have Jesus raised from the dead. Somehow, the blood of that sacrifice has to be taken into the heavenly place, into the heavenly temple, so it can be applied to the altar in this heavenly place. How in the world can that happen? Hebrews tells us that it works because Jesus sheds his blood and then takes that blood and through the ascension takes it up into the heavenly places, the very place where Jesus is qualified to be a priest by the power of his indestructible life, and then applies it to the heavenly altar in order to work out atonement for us. Now, if there's any truth to this at all, and I'm becoming increasingly convinced that there's a lot more than a little bit of truth to it, then what that means is that the ascension cannot be thought of as one more thing that we just kind of tack on to the life of Jesus as kind of a bookend, or as a way to say, where did the body go? It becomes a vitally important and crucial part of our understanding of what it means to be atoned for, what salvation is in the first place. In my early days as a Christian, I remember thinking that atonement felt like it was this big mystery and that nobody really understood it or how to explain it. And I became increasingly convinced that just because we don't necessarily know how to explain it doesn't mean that God doesn't know how it all works. And what we see throughout all the tapestry of Scripture is that God was setting up a way of understanding how atonement works for thousands of years before Jesus came. And so if atonement is a mystery to us, it's not because God didn't tell us how it worked, it's just that sometimes we're not really great at listening. So now I hope that if anybody asks you about the importance of the Scripture, I hope you have at least a little bit more to say than just a shrug of the shoulders. Well, that's all for today. If you have any questions or any topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.